The quiet morning that sparked chaos. Walter Jameson, a sprightly 82-year-old, started his mornings with ritualistic precision. He lived in a modest suburban neighborhood in Ridgewood, a town known for its tranquil streets and tight-knit community. Every day, Walter brewed himself a strong cup of coffee, sat by the window of his cozy home, and read the morning paper. His life, though solitary after his wife's passing, was rich with simple pleasures: gardening, visits to the library, and driving his cherished deep blue Audi, a gift from his son Marcus. Marcus Jameson was the pride of Ridgewood. A financial genius, Marcus had built a tech empire from scratch, pulling his family out of modest beginnings. Though his success kept him in bustling cities and boardrooms, he never failed to check in on his father. The Audi was more than just a luxury car. It was a symbol of gratitude, love, and respect for a man who had sacrificed everything for his son's education and future. On a crisp fall morning, Walter decided to visit the local farmer's market. Dressed in his signature cardigan and neatly pressed trousers, he exuded the kind of dignity that only a life well-lived could afford. The Audi, polished to a mirror-like sheen, gleamed under the golden sunlight as Walter carefully reversed out of his driveway. The drive to the market was uneventful, as it often was in Ridgewood. Walter's mind wandered to what he might pick up, perhaps some fresh apples or a jar of honey. But unbeknownst to him, the serenity of his day was about to be shattered by an incident that would not only shake his life, but also ripple through the very fabric of the town. The other side of town. Officer Ethan Grady had been with the Ridgewood Police Department for over a decade. His colleagues often joked that he had a sixth sense for trouble, but what they didn't say, at least not openly, was that his instincts were often colored by prejudices he wasn't willing to confront. That morning, as he sipped his coffee in his patrol car, a call came over the radio about a potential car theft in progress at the farmer's market. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but Ethan's adrenaline spiked. The market was in a wealthy part of town, and a stolen vehicle there usually meant high-profile trouble. Ethan's mind began racing, his biases filling in the blanks before he even arrived on the scene. The market incident. Walter parked his Audi in the bustling lot of the farmer's market and stepped out, pocketing his keys. He took a deep breath, savoring the crisp autumn air and the faint aroma of freshly baked bread wafting from the nearby stalls. The market was lively, filled with families, vendors, and couples enjoying the sunny morning. As Walter browsed through a stall of vibrant oranges and apples, Ethan's patrol car pulled into the lot. His sharp eyes scanned the area, landing on the Audi almost instantly. The car was pristine, with sleek lines and a glossy finish that screamed affluence. But what caught his attention next was Walter, a modestly dressed elderly black man walking back toward the luxury car with a shopping bag in hand. Ethan's gut tightened. This doesn't add up, he thought. He watched as Walter placed the bag on the passenger seat, humming softly to himself. Then, as Walter pulled out his keyed fob to unlock the car, Ethan's doubts solidified into suspicion. The officer stepped out of his patrol car and adjusted his utility belt. His approach was slow but deliberate, each step heavy with unspoken judgment. Walter, noticing the uniformed man walking toward him, offered a friendly smile. "Good morning, officer," Walter greeted, his voice warm and sincere. Ethan's face remained stoic. "Is this your car, sir?" he asked, his tone clipped. Walter blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, officer, it is," he replied, holding up the key fob. "Is something wrong?" "Do you have proof of ownership?" Ethan pressed, his hand resting near his holster. Walter frowned slightly, puzzled. "The key is proof enough, isn't it?" he asked gently. "I'm not sure what you're implying." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I need to see your registration and ID. Cars like these don't just belong to anyone." The witness. Nearby, Maria Alvarez, a local schoolteacher, had been loading groceries into her car when she noticed the interaction. Something about the officer's posture and tone didn't sit right with her. Maria wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but years of teaching in diverse classrooms had made her keenly aware of implicit biases. She pulled out her phone and began recording, her heart heavy with unease. As she watched, Walter calmly explained that the car was a gift from his son and that the registration was at home. He offered to call Marcus to confirm the ownership, but Ethan waved him off. "Digital proof doesn't cut it," Ethan said, his voice growing sharper. "Step away from the vehicle." Walter hesitated. "Officer, I'm not sure what's happening here, but I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding. This car is mine." But Ethan wasn't listening. Years of unchecked prejudice had clouded his judgment. To him, Walter didn't fit the profile of someone who should own a car like that. His mind was made up. The arrest. Ethan pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, I have a potential vehicle theft suspect. Requesting backup," he said, his eyes still locked on Walter. Walter's face fell, a mix of confusion and indignation flashing across his features. "You can't be serious," he said quietly. "I'm an 82-year-old man. Do I look like someone who would steal a car?" "Step away from the vehicle," Ethan repeated, his voice now laced with authority. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Maria continued filming, her fingers trembling with anger. "This isn't right," she muttered under her breath. Walter, ever composed, stepped back from the car. "I'll cooperate, officer," he said, "but you're making a mistake." Without warning, Ethan reached for Walter's arm, pulling it behind his back to cuff him. The older man winced, his frail body unable to resist the unnecessary force. The crowd gasped, and murmurs of discontent rippled through the onlookers. Maria's voice rang out. "This is wrong. He hasn't done anything." Ethan ignored her, his focus solely on Walter. As he placed the elderly man in the back of the patrol car, he noticed the crowd growing larger. Phones were out, cameras recording every second of the incident. The call that changed everything. Meanwhile, Maria uploaded her video to social media with a caption. "This is how our elders are treated in Ridgewood. An innocent man wrongfully accused. This has to stop." Within minutes, the video began to gain traction. It wasn't long before Marcus, sitting in a boardroom miles away, received a text with the video link. His heart sank as he watched his father, the man who had raised him with dignity and integrity, being treated like a criminal. "This is unacceptable," Marcus said, his voice trembling with rage. He stood abruptly, startling his colleagues. "I need to handle this." With a few swift calls, Marcus activated his extensive network, rallying lawyers, media contacts, and community leaders. What Ethan Grady had dismissed as a routine stop was about to become a nationwide controversy. The storm begins. As the sun climbed higher into the Ridgewood sky, the tranquil farmers' market turned into an arena of tension and unease. Walter Jameson, a man who had spent decades earning the respect and admiration of his community, sat uncomfortably in the back of a patrol car. His frail hands, now cuffed, rested on his lap as he gazed out of the window, his expression calm but heavy with unspoken sorrow. The once bustling parking lot was now a scene of outrage, as onlookers whispered among themselves, and a few bold voices began questioning the officer's actions. The son's reaction. Miles away, Marcus Jameson was in the middle of a high-stakes meeting in Manhattan. His tech firm, Jameson Ventures, had just secured a groundbreaking partnership, and Marcus was presenting to a room of executives. But his focus shattered when his phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. At first, he ignored it, his professionalism keeping him on track. Then it buzzed again, and again. Apologizing briefly, he glanced at his phone. The words on the screen stopped him cold. "Your dad's in trouble. Look at this." With trembling fingers, Marcus opened the link. The video loaded slowly, his heart pounding with each passing second. When it finally played, he saw his father, a man who had never harmed anyone, who had spent his life teaching generations of students, being manhandled by a police officer. The video showed Walter's calm explanations falling on deaf ears, the officer's hand gripping his father's arm tightly as he cuffed him and shoved him into the back seat of a patrol car. Marcus's jaw tightened, his breathing shallow. He replayed the video twice, trying to process what he was seeing. The faces of his colleagues blurred as anger, disbelief, and fear surged through him. His father wasn't just a man to Marcus. He was his hero, the reason Marcus had fought so hard to succeed. "I have to go," Marcus announced abruptly, his voice clipped with urgency. He grabbed his briefcase and left the room, ignoring the startled looks from the executives. In the elevator, Marcus's mind raced. He made 2 quick calls, one to his personal assistant, instructing her to book a private jet immediately, and another to his lawyer, Devin Marks. Devin was a sharp and relentless advocate, known for dismantling cases of systemic bias and misconduct. "Devin, I need you on this now," Marcus said, his voice shaking but firm. "My father was just arrested. It's a false charge. There's a video circulating online." "I'll pull the video and review it immediately," Devin replied. "We'll handle this, Marcus. Don't worry." But Marcus did worry. His father's dignity was at stake, and no amount of wealth or influence could undo what had already been done. Back at the scene, at the farmer's market, the crowd around the patrol car had swelled. Maria Alvarez, still recording on her phone, began speaking directly to her audience. "This is what happens when bias clouds judgment," she said, her voice steady but passionate. "This man is 82 years old. He's a retired teacher, a pillar of our community. And this officer thinks he stole a car because, why? Because he doesn't look like he should own it." The crowd murmured in agreement, and several others began recording, adding their voices to the growing outrage. Ethan Grady, the officer in question, began to feel the weight of the stares and whispers. His confidence faltered for a moment, but he quickly suppressed it, his authority a shield against the rising tide of dissent. "Everyone needs to back off," Ethan barked, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is a police matter. Stay out of it." Maria, undeterred, stepped forward. "You're wrong, officer," she said boldly. "This isn't just a police matter. It's about accountability. We're not going anywhere." The legal machine roars to life. Meanwhile, Marcus's jet touched down at a nearby airstrip, and a sleek black car was waiting to whisk him away. His mind was a storm of emotions as he stared out of the window, rehearsing what he might say when he sought his father. Was Walter scared? Hurt? Marcus couldn't bear the thought. Devin had already begun assembling a legal and public relations team. By the time Marcus's car pulled up to the Ridgewood Police Department, the story was making national headlines. News vans were parked outside the station, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters scrambling to gather details. Marcus stepped out of the car, his tailored suit and commanding presence exuding authority. He walked past the reporters without a word, his focus singular. His father. Inside the station, chaos reigned. Phones rang incessantly, and officers whispered nervously about the media frenzy outside. Father and son reunite. In the holding area, Walter sat on a cold metal bench, his hands now free but his heart weighed down by humiliation. When Marcus entered, Walter's eyes brightened briefly, but his face remained calm. "Marcus," he said softly, rising to greet his son. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice breaking. He embraced Walter, holding him tightly. "I'm so sorry this happened." Walter patted his son's back reassuringly. "It's not your fault, son. I'm fine, just a little shaken." But Marcus wasn't fine. Seeing his father in that room, treated like a criminal, ignited a fire in him. "I'm going to fix this," he promised. Devin entered moments later, carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Jameson, Mr. Walter," he greeted them. "We're going to make this right." Devin's team had already filed a formal complaint against Officer Grady, citing racial bias and unlawful detainment. The video Maria recorded had been downloaded and shared millions of times, sparking a nationwide conversation about systemic racism in law enforcement. confronting the officer. Outside the station, Ethan Grady was oblivious to the magnitude of the storm he had unleashed. When Marcus stepped out with Devin and Walter, flanked by cameras and reporters, the officer froze. Marcus's glare was unrelenting as he approached Ethan. "This is the man you accused of stealing a car?" Marcus asked, his voice low but filled with simmering anger. Ethan squared his shoulders, trying to maintain composure. "I was doing my job." "Your job," Marcus said, his voice rising. "Your job is to protect and serve, not harass innocent people based on your prejudices. My father has spent his life contributing to this community. What have you done, aside from disgracing your badge?" The crowd outside erupted in cheers and applause. Ethan's face reddened, but he said nothing. He turned and walked back into the station, his confidence shattered. A movement begins. Over the next few days, Marcus's legal team worked tirelessly to clear Walter's name and hold Officer Grady accountable. The case drew national attention, sparking protests and rallies in Ridgewood and beyond. Walter, who had always avoided the spotlight, found himself at the center of a movement. "I'm just an old man who wanted to buy some apples," Walter said at a press conference, his voice humble but resolute. "But if this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. We need to do better." His words resonated deeply, becoming a rallying cry for change. The incident prompted the Ridgewood Police Department to initiate mandatory bias training for all officers, and Officer Grady was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The beginning of justice. Though Walter's ordeal was painful, it brought long overdue scrutiny to the biases that lurked in the system. Marcus used his resources to establish a foundation in his father's name, dedicated to combating racial injustice and supporting victims of discrimination. Walter returned to his quiet life, but his dignity remained intact, and his bond with his son grew even stronger. Together, they proved that even in the face of injustice, dignity and resilience could light the way forward. Unmasking the system. The national spotlight now squarely focused on Ridgewood, a town once known for its idyllic charm, but now embroiled in controversy. Walter Jamison's ordeal had become a flashpoint for discussions about racial bias in policing, with protests erupting in cities far beyond Ridgewood's borders. The quiet farmers' market parking lot, where the incident began, was now a site of pilgrimage for activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens seeking change. Meanwhile, Marcus Jamison was tireless in his efforts to hold the Ridgewood Police Department accountable. The foundation he established in his father's name, the Walter Jamison Initiative for Justice and Equality, had already garnered widespread support, raising millions within its first few weeks. But Marcus knew money wasn't enough. He needed systemic change, a community divided. Ridgewood was no longer the harmonious town it had once appeared to be. The incident had unearthed deep divisions among its residents. Some rallied behind Walter, outraged by the blatant injustice. They saw the incident as a symptom of a larger systemic problem that could no longer be ignored. Others, however, sided with Officer Ethan Grady. They argued that he was simply doing his job and criticized what they perceived as a rush to judgment against the police force. These voices, though smaller in number, were loud and persistent, further polarizing the town. Tensions reached a boiling point during a town hall meeting organized by the mayor to address the controversy. The meeting, held in Ridgewood's high school gymnasium, drew hundreds of attendees, including local residents, activists, and members of the media. The town hall showdown. The gymnasium buzzed with tension as people filed in, their faces reflecting a mix of anger, hope, and determination. At the front of the room sat a panel that included Ridgewood's police chief, the mayor, and a visibly uncomfortable Ethan Grady. Marcus and Walter sat in the audience, their presence drawing a standing ovation from one side of the room and murmurs of discontent from the other. The mayor, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a perpetually worried expression, opened the meeting. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice shaky, We're here to address the concerns raised by recent events and to find a way forward as a community. The first few speakers echoed sentiments of outrage, their voices passionate but controlled. Then Maria Alvarez took the microphone. Her voice, clear and unwavering, carried through the gymnasium. "What happened to Mr. Jameson is not an isolated incident," she said, holding up her phone. "This video, which has been viewed by millions, shows exactly what's wrong with our system. We need accountability. We need transparency. And we need change." The crowd erupted in applause, drowning out a smattering of boos. Maria stepped down, her eyes briefly meeting Walter's. He nodded in gratitude. Next, a middle-aged man in a flannel shirt took the mic. "Officer Grady was doing his job," he said, his tone defensive. "If we start questioning every officer's decisions, how can they do their jobs effectively? This whole thing is being blown out of proportion." Marcus, unable to stay silent any longer, rose to speak. The room quieted as he walked to the microphone, his presence commanding attention. "My name is Marcus Jameson," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I am the son of Walter Jameson, the man you saw in that video. My father is not a criminal. He is a retired teacher, a mentor to generations, and the kindest man I've ever known." He paused, scanning the room. "This isn't about one officer or one incident. It's about a culture that allows prejudice to go unchecked. My father's dignity was stolen that day, but he's not the only one. How many more stories like his go untold because there's no camera to capture them?" The crowd erupted in applause again, this time louder and more unified. Even some who had been hesitant to support the Jameson family found themselves moved by Marcus's words. The department under scrutiny. Behind closed doors, the Ridgewood Police Department was in turmoil. Chief Emma Carlisle, a seasoned officer known for her no-nonsense demeanor, was grappling with the fallout. She knew the department couldn't afford to lose public trust, but she also had to navigate the internal backlash from officers who felt betrayed by her attempts to enforce stricter accountability measures. Ethan Grady's administrative leave had turned into a suspension as more details about his history came to light. A thorough review of his record revealed multiple complaints of biased behavior, most of which had been quietly dismissed. The department's lack of action on these complaints became a scandal of its own. Chief Carlisle called an emergency meeting with her leadership team. "We're not just dealing with one bad decision," she said, her voice firm. "We're dealing with a pattern of behavior that our department failed to address. That ends now." She announced a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training, a new oversight committee, and a policy requiring all officers to wear body cameras. The reforms were met with mixed reactions from her team, but Carlisle was resolute. Walter speaks out. While Marcus led the fight in courtrooms and boardrooms, Walter chose a quieter but equally impactful path. He began speaking at community centers, schools, and churches, sharing his story not to incite anger but to inspire change. At one such event, held at a local church, Walter stood before a diverse audience of young and old, his presence calm yet commanding. "I've lived a long life," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "And in all those years, I've learned that fear and ignorance are the roots of prejudice. What happened to me wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about a mindset, a way of thinking that needs to change." He paused, looking out at the audience. "We can't fight hate with hate. We need to educate. We need to listen. And most importantly, we need to act. Not out of anger, but out of a desire to build something better." His words resonated deeply, sparking standing ovations and heartfelt conversations. Walter's message of unity and understanding became a beacon of hope for a community struggling to heal. The media frenzy. The national media latched onto every development, turning the Jameson family story into a rallying cry for police reform. News anchors debated the implications of Walter's case, while opinion pieces dissected the systemic issues it highlighted. A hashtag Justice for Walter trended for weeks, with celebrities and influencers amplifying the cause. For Marcus, The attention was a double-edged sword. While it brought visibility to the issue, it also invited scrutiny and criticism. Some accused him of exploiting the situation for personal gain, while others questioned whether his wealth and influence had skewed the narrative. But Marcus refused to let the noise distract him. "This isn't about me," he told a reporter during an interview. "It's about my father and everyone like him who has faced injustice. If my resources can help bring about change, then that's exactly what I'll use them for." The beginning of change. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of Walter's case became evident. The Ridgewood Police Department implemented its reforms, and other departments across the country began adopting similar measures. Officer Grady faced formal charges of misconduct and racial profiling, and his trial became a pivotal moment in the fight for accountability. But for Walter and Marcus, the journey was far from over. They knew that true change would take time and persistence. Together, they continued to advocate for justice, using their platform to amplify the voices of those who had long been silenced. The trial of Officer Grady. The day had finally arrived. After months of investigation, national scrutiny, and relentless advocacy, the trial of Officer Ethan Grady began. The courtroom in Ridgewood was packed to capacity, with reporters, activists, and community members vying for seats. Outside, protesters lined the streets, holding signs with messages like "Justice for Walter" and "End racial profiling now." The atmosphere was electric, charged with both hope and tension. The stakes are set. For Marcus Jameson, this trial was more than just about his father. It was about setting a precedent. The legal team, led by the sharp and relentless Devin Marks, had built a case that exposed not only Ethan Grady's actions, but also the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked for years. Walter Jameson, ever the composed and dignified presence, sat quietly beside Marcus, his expression unreadable. His calm demeanor masked the storm of emotions swirling within him: anger, sadness, and a deep sense of responsibility. He had never wanted to be at the center of such a spectacle, but now that he was, he knew the weight of his testimony could tip the scales of justice. On the other side of the courtroom, Officer Grady sat stiffly at the defendant's table, flanked by his attorneys. His face was a mask of defiance, but there was an undercurrent of unease in his posture. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he knew it. Opening arguments. The prosecutor, a fiery attorney named Lydia Caldwell, opened the trial with a powerful statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not just about one man's poor judgment. It's about the biases and prejudices that led to an innocent man being treated like a criminal. Walter Jameson did nothing wrong. He was simply living his life, a life that was disrupted, humiliated, and put in danger by the actions of the defendant, Officer Ethan Grady." Caldwell methodically laid out the prosecution's case, highlighting the video recorded by Maria Alvarez, Grady's documented history of complaints, and the department's failure to address those complaints. The defense, led by an equally skilled lawyer named Henry Wade, took a different approach. Wade argued that Grady had acted in accordance with his training, and that his actions, while regrettable, did not constitute a crime. "This case is about perception," Wade said. Officer Grady was faced with a situation that, to him, appeared suspicious. His duty is to investigate and ensure public safety. While we all wish things had gone differently, hindsight cannot be used to judge actions taken in the moment. Walter's testimony. When Walter took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. His presence, calm yet commanding, filled the space. As he recounted the events of that fateful day, his voice remained steady, but his words carried the weight of his experience. "I have lived in Ridgewood for over 50 years, he began. "I taught generations of students in this town. I've never stolen anything in my life, let alone a car. That day I was treated like a criminal, not because of anything I did, but because of how I look." Walter described the humiliation he felt as Grady's accusations escalated, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke about being handcuffed and placed in the patrol car. His dignity, though intact, had been deeply wounded. When the prosecution asked him how the experience had affected him, Walter paused. "It made me question things I've always believed," he said softly. "I've always believed in fairness, in justice. That day, I didn't feel any of those things." The defense cross-examined Walter but failed to shake his credibility. His testimony was heartfelt and unwavering, painting a picture of a man wronged by the very system that should have protected him. The turning point. One of the most pivotal moments in the trial came when the prosecution called Maria Alvarez to the stand. Maria, whose video had sparked the national outcry, was articulate and unflinching as she described what she had witnessed. "It wasn't just the way Officer Grady spoke to Mr. Jameson," she said. "It was his entire demeanor. He wasn't trying to resolve the situation. He had already decided that Mr. Jameson was guilty." Maria's video was played for the jury, the sound of Walter's calm explanations juxtaposed with Grady's increasingly harsh tone. The courtroom was silent as the video ended, the weight of the evidence sinking in. The prosecution followed up by presenting Grady's personnel records, which revealed a troubling pattern of behavior. Over a decade on the force, he had amassed multiple complaints of racial profiling and excessive force, most of which had been quietly dismissed or settled internally. When Grady himself took the stand, his testimony did little to help his case. While he maintained that he had acted in good faith, his inability to justify his suspicions about Walter only reinforced the perception of bias. Marcus speaks out. Outside the courtroom, Marcus continued his advocacy, using the media to amplify the broader issues at play. In interviews, he emphasized that this case wasn't just about his father. "My father's experience is a reflection of what countless others go through every day," Marcus said during a live interview. "We have an opportunity here to not only hold one person accountable, but to demand better from the systems meant to serve us." Marcus's words resonated deeply, and the Walter Jameson Initiative for Justice and Equality gained even more traction. Donations poured in, and prominent figures voiced their support, making it clear that the case had become a symbol of a much larger movement. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and impassioned arguments, the trial reached its conclusion. The jury deliberated for 2 days, their decision anxiously awaited by the public. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom was packed, with hundreds more gathered outside. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Ethan Grady, guilty of misconduct and racial profiling." The words echoed through the courtroom, met with gasps, cheers, and a few shouts of outrage. Walter closed his eyes, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over him. Justice had been served, but it couldn't erase what he had endured. Grady's conviction marked a significant victory for the Jameson family and their supporters. It was a rare instance of accountability in a system often criticized for its lack of it. But for Marcus and Walter, the work was far from over. A catalyst for change. The trial's outcome sparked a wave of reforms, not only in Ridgewood but in police departments across the country. The Walter Jameson Initiative partnered with lawmakers to draft new legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in law enforcement. For Walter, the trial had been a painful but necessary journey. As he returned to his quiet life, he found solace in the knowledge that his ordeal had sparked meaningful change. His son, ever determined, continued to fight for a better future, using his influence and resources to ensure that no one else would have to endure what his father had. Ripples of transformation. The trial of Officer Ethan Grady had concluded, but its reverberations continued to ripple far beyond the confines of the courtroom. In Ridgewood, the streets were alive with discussions, debates, and a newfound determination to confront uncomfortable truths. Across the country, the case of Walter Jameson became a watershed moment, sparking deeper introspection about systemic inequities in law enforcement and beyond. Walter and Marcus Jameson, though relieved by the verdict, knew the fight was far from over. For them, the trial was merely the beginning, a battle won in a war that required sustained effort, education, and relentless advocacy. Together, They set out to transform the momentum into a lasting legacy. Healing in the community. Ridgewood's reputation as a serene and idyllic town had been forever altered. For some, this change was unsettling. For others, it was overdue. Churches, schools, and community centers began hosting open forums to discuss racial bias, systemic discrimination, and how Ridgewood could evolve into a more inclusive community. One such forum was held at Ridgewood High School, where Walter had taught for over 3 decades. The auditorium was filled with familiar faces, former students, parents, and colleagues, all eager to hear from a man they deeply respected. Walter stood at the podium, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've always believed that education is the foundation of progress," he began. "But education isn't just about what happens in classrooms. It's about what we teach each other every day, through our actions, our words, and our willingness to listen." He paused, looking out at the audience. "What happened to me was painful, but it opened a door. And now it's up to all of us to step through it. We can't change the past, but we can shape the future." The applause was thunderous, and many in the audience left the forum inspired to take action. Former students of Walter's began organizing initiatives, from mentorship programs for marginalized youth to petitions demanding further police reforms. Ridgewood, once content in its complacency, was beginning to transform. Marcus's mission. Marcus Jameson had always been driven, but the events surrounding his father's ordeal had unlocked a deeper sense of purpose. The Walter Jameson Initiative for Justice and Equality became his full-time focus. With his business acumen and vast network, Marcus began building partnerships with organizations, activists, and lawmakers dedicated to systemic change. One of the initiative's first major projects was the creation of the Jameson Justice Fellowship, a program designed to support young lawyers, community organizers, and educators working to address issues of racial inequality. Within months, the fellowship attracted hundreds of applicants from across the country, all eager to contribute to the movement sparked by Walter's story. Marcus also leveraged his influence in the tech industry to address another critical issue: the role of technology in perpetuating bias. He convened a summit of industry leaders to discuss ways to eliminate algorithmic bias in law enforcement tools, such as facial recognition software and predictive policing systems. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," Marcus said during the summit's keynote speech. "It's about creating something better, something that serves everyone fairly and equitably." Ethan Grady's reckoning. While the Jameson family worked tirelessly to turn their pain into progress, Ethan Grady faced the consequences of his actions. Stripped of his badge and disgraced in the eyes of his community, Grady became a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power and prejudice. Grady's conviction didn't just end his career, it shattered the facade of invincibility that had shielded him for years. But even as he faced legal and social repercussions, Grady struggled to accept responsibility for his actions. In interviews and statements, he often framed himself as a victim of cancel culture, blaming the media and public outcry for his downfall. However, there was one moment that hinted at a glimmer of introspection. During a mandated restorative justice session, a condition of his sentencing, Grady came face to face with Walter. The session was facilitated by a mediator and designed to foster understanding between the offender and the victim. For several minutes, the two men sat in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Walter broke the silence. "I don't hate you, Officer Grady," he said quietly, "but I need you to understand the harm you caused, not just to me, but to this entire community." Grady looked down, his usual bravado absent. "I thought I was doing my job," he muttered. "But maybe I wasn't seeing things clearly." The session ended without a definitive resolution, but it planted a seed. Whether Grady would grow from the experience remained to be seen, but for Walter, the act of confronting his oppressor was a step toward closure. The role of the media. The media's role in amplifying Walter's story had been both a blessing and a challenge. On one hand, the widespread attention forced institutions to act, and brought critical issues to the forefront of public consciousness. On the other hand, it subjected the Jameson family to relentless scrutiny and, at times, vicious attacks from detractors. Walter, ever the wise and steady presence, approached the media circus with a mix of grace and pragmatism. "If my story can help even one person feel seen, then it's worth it," he told a journalist during an interview. Maria Alvarez, the woman whose video had ignited the movement, also became a prominent voice in the conversation. She transitioned from being an observer to an active participant, using her platform to advocate for citizen journalism and accountability. "We all have a role to play," Maria said during a panel discussion. "Sometimes it's as simple as pressing record. But it's what we do after that that truly matters." The family's legacy. As the months turned into years, the Jameson family story became a cornerstone of the broader fight for justice. Walter, now in his mid-80s, continued to inspire through his speeches and writings. He published a memoir titled Roses in the Storm, a teacher's journey through injustice, which became a bestseller and was later adapted into a documentary. Marcus, ever the visionary, expanded the reach of the Walter Jameson Initiative, creating international chapters and forging alliances with global human rights organizations. He also worked to bridge generational divides, ensuring that young activists had the tools and mentorship needed to carry the torch forward. The small garden behind Walter's house, once a quiet refuge, became a symbol of resilience and growth. On the anniversary of the trial's verdict, Marcus surprised his father by commissioning a bronze plaque to be placed among the roses. It read, "In honor of Walter Jameson, an educator, a father, and a voice for justice. May we always strive to bloom in the face of adversity." A movement unfolding. The story of Walter and Marcus Jameson was far from over. It had sparked a movement that continued to grow, fueled by the passion and perseverance of countless individuals inspired by their journey. Ridgewood, once a quiet town content with the status quo, became a model for change. A reminder that even the smallest communities can have a profound impact on the world. And as Walter tended to his roses, their petals vibrant and full of life, he knew that his story, though born of pain, had become a catalyst for something beautiful, a legacy beyond the storm. Years had passed since Walter Jameson's ordeal had captured the nation's attention. The incident, though born of injustice, became the seed of a global movement for change, a testament to the power of resilience, advocacy, and unity. Walter and Marcus Jameson's lives had shifted in ways they could never have imagined. Their personal tragedy transformed into a legacy that reached far beyond Ridgewood. But the journey was far from over. The Walter Jameson Initiative for Justice and Equality continued to grow, evolving into a multifaceted organization tackling systemic inequities on multiple fronts. From community reform to technological innovation, education, and global outreach, the Jamesons remained at the forefront of a revolution that promised a brighter future. A family's continued mission. At 88 years old, Walter still carried himself with the same calm dignity that had defined him throughout his life. His movements were slower now, his frame slightly bent with age, but his spirit remained unyielding. He had become a revered figure, affectionately called Professor Jameson by activists and leaders who sought his wisdom. One crisp morning, Walter prepared to attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new educational center funded by the Walter Jameson Initiative. Located in the heart of Ridgewood, the center was designed to provide mentorship, legal aid, and vocational training for underprivileged youth. It was a dream Walter had long held close to his heart, a way to ensure that education, the cornerstone of his life, could empower future generations. As he walked into the center's bright, bustling lobby, Walter was greeted by a group of young students holding signs that read, "Thank you, Professor Jameson." Tears welled in his eyes as he shook their hands, their enthusiasm rekindling the fire that had always driven him. Marcus, standing beside him, placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You did this, Dad," he said quietly. "This is your legacy." Walter smiled but shook his head. "No, son. We did this. The global reach of the initiative. Marcus's vision for the Walter Jameson Initiative had grown exponentially. What began as a response to his father's experience in Ridgewood had become a global network of activists, educators, and innovators. The initiative now operated in over 20 countries, addressing issues like racial profiling, police reform, and educational disparities on an international scale. One of the initiative's most ambitious projects was the development of a cutting-edge training program for law enforcement. Designed in collaboration with sociologists, psychologists, and community leaders, the program used virtual reality simulations to teach officers how to recognize and overcome their biases. Early results showed a marked improvement in community relations in cities where the program was implemented. Marcus also spearheaded efforts to hold tech companies accountable for creating systems that perpetuated bias. Under his leadership, the initiative partnered with global firms to design ethical algorithms for law enforcement and social services. These innovations were celebrated as game changers, proving that technology could be a force for equity rather than division. The next generation. The Jameson family story inspired countless young people to take up the mantle of justice. Among them was Ava Carter, a college student who had been deeply moved by Walter's memoir. Ava, whose own family had experienced racial discrimination, reached out to the initiative, hoping to contribute in any way she could. Through her involvement, Ava founded a youth advocacy program within the initiative, focusing on empowering teenagers to challenge systemic injustices in their schools and communities. The program quickly gained traction, with chapters forming in high schools and colleges across the country. One day, Ava invited Walter to speak at a leadership summit she had organized. Despite his age, Walter accepted without hesitation. Standing before a room filled with eager young faces, he delivered a speech that would resonate for years to come. "Every generation has the power to shape the world," he said. "But power means nothing without purpose. Use your voices, use your minds. And never forget that the greatest change often starts with the simplest act of courage." Ava, sitting in the front row, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the students rise to their feet, applauding the man who had inspired them all. Ridgewood's transformation. The town of Ridgewood had undergone a profound transformation. What was once a community reluctant to confront its own flaws had become a model for reconciliation and progress. The police department, now under the leadership of Chief Emma Carlisle, had implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory body cameras, independent oversight, and regular community dialogues. A mural was painted in the town square to commemorate Walter's story. It depicted an elderly man tending to a garden, surrounded by blooming roses, a tribute to Walter's quiet strength and the beauty he had nurtured even in the face of adversity. Beneath the mural, a plaque read, "In honor of Walter Jameson and all those who fight for justice. May we never stop growing." A moment of reflection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter sat in his garden, the soft hum of crickets filling the air. Marcus joined him, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses in hand. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the roses sway gently in the breeze. "You've done so much, Dad," Marcus said finally, his voice tinged with awe. "I hope you know how proud I am of you." Walter chuckled softly. "I'm proud of you too, son. You took something painful and turned it into something meaningful. That's not easy to do." Marcus looked at his father, the man who had taught him everything he knew about resilience, kindness, and integrity. "None of this would have been possible without you," he said. "You're the foundation of everything." Walter reached out and patted his son's hand. "We've both built something together," he said. "And if we've planted the seeds for others to grow, then that's enough for me." A new chapter. As Walter and Marcus looked toward the future, they knew their work was far from finished. But they also knew that the legacy they had built would endure. The movement they started had taken on a life of its own, carried forward by the countless individuals they had inspired. And so, as the garden bloomed around them, Walter and Marcus Jameson prepared for the next chapter of their journey. Together, They had turned pain into progress, and their story into a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest storms, there is always room for growth.